and happy Independence Day. Willy the composer is back for the obligatory July 4th video, and I decided I'd do something a little bit different this year. I'm going to be doing the history of the United States from memory. So that means that I haven't done any research. I haven't really even seen or read anything about the United States in like a couple of weeks at this point, so everything you're going to hear is just stuff I have memorized and stuff I've just known for years, and stuff that people will know and Americans should know. Just so you know that I'm not cheating. I'm not looking at anything. I have my phone and my computer right here, which is also why there's no audio setup, because I need my computer to do an audio setup. But yeah, let's just try and get this started. I guess the point of this video is to really challenge myself and just try and do a couple things that are very difficult. I want to cover as many different topics as possible, as quickly as possible, and I don't want to add a lot of detail. I don't want to go into rants or go off, into a tangent. I don't want these kind of things, and also there's going to be no editing, which is going to be difficult because every time I make a little verbal mistake or I sputter on my words or what I'm going to say next, it's going to have to stay in. And if I screw up too bad, I have to start over. So, let's get started. The continent of North America came into being when it broke away from Pangea about 120 million years ago, before the dinosaurs died out. But people didn't come to America until, I'd say, about 11,000 years ago, 9,000 BC, maybe 10,000, in that range. At the end of the last ice age, there were definitely people here. There is evidence that people were here earlier. There's a little bit of a dispute. The main theory for how people got over here is still the Bering Land Bridge, which the Bering Sea between modern Alaska and Russia dried up during the Ice Age, which allowed people to just walk right over from Asia down into North America and then South America. But there is some contradicting evidence, and some people have interesting theories about people having made it across the Pacific Ocean, because there seems to be evidence of human habitation in South America that predates evidence of human habitation in North America, which you wouldn't expect with the land bridge hypothesis, but that's still generally what people accept as how the Native Americans came to be. Now, to just say the Native Americans is really kind of generalistic. They were a very diverse, I don't even want to say group of people. They were diverse groups of people. They had, even at the time of the arrival of the Europeans, they had very different levels of technology and development, and their societies were structured in all different ways, and they spoke many different languages and had all these different customs, and depending on whatever region you live in or even small area that you live in, the natives there could be very different from the way they are over there, So, some had agriculture. Some had fully settled cities like they did down in Mexico. Some built huge monuments, others didn't really build anything. Others were hunter-gatherers, some were pastoralists, and there were nomads, and there were all sorts of different types of Native Americans. But this isn't the history of them, is it? This is the history of the United States of America, which is a nation founded by Europeans. So we'll talk about the first arrival of Europeans onto the continent of North America, which a lot of people know was the Vikings, who came over from Greenland, and they definitely landed in Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador. There's archaeological evidence of that. They called it Vinland. They didn't stick around for long, but here's the thing. Some people have postulated, I guess, that they might have gone as far south as modern-day United States. They might have made it to Massachusetts even. But there's not any hard evidence of that. So, if we want somebody to land on the continental United States, we're going to have to wait a couple hundred more years. And really, the person who started it all, who's responsible for everything, is Christopher Columbus. Now, he gets a bad rap nowadays. People don't really like him. It's sort of the in thing to crap on Christopher Columbus. But here's the thing. Christopher Columbus absolutely did discover America. I've said it before, but the word discover doesn't mean to be the first person to see something. It means to see something for the first time. So yes, there were already Indians living there. Yes, the Vikings had been to North America before. But it was with Christopher Columbus's new discovery of North America that the Old World and the New World really began to interact. And it started everything. So he does deserve the credit that he has gotten. He has 2 state capitals named after him. The National Capital District of Columbia is named after him. So, you know, he is an important figure, and he shouldn't be as rejected. His achievements shouldn't be as minimized as they seem to be nowadays. Even if he was a bad person, what difference does that make? The Spanish were the first to really get into North America. Most of the center of their empire and influence in North America was more in Mexico and the Caribbean and Central America. But they did foray into the modern-day United States. The famous establishment of St. Augustine in 1565 was the first permanent settlement by Europeans in the modern-day United States. But they also went into Texas and New Mexico, Santa Fe, which is as old as the 1600s, and even into California as early as the 1700s. There were missions being founded all along the coast of California. These are now the major cities of California: San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Monterey, all started by the Spanish. Well, no, let's just go straight, yeah. The Spanish were the dominant naval power of the time, back in the 1500s and 1600s, but a big rival of theirs was England. And the English were trying to become the new naval power. And they thought that having this wealth of new land and potential resources, and it was just an excellent new avenue, and Spain took full advantage of it. Portugal took advantage of it. France started taking advantage of it. England knew that they had to get in, you know, and compete with all those Catholic nations, you know. So England tried their first colony, which was the failed colony of Roanoke, in 1585, I want to say. I'm not sure. But it didn't really work out. Make a long story short, they left some settlers there, and when they came back the next year, they were all gone, and nobody knows for sure where they really went. The first successful, as they call it, the first permanent settlement by the English was in 1607, I want to say, somewhere around then, in Jamestown, Virginia. And that's where the Pocahontas stories come from. And the other big one, the thing with Jamestown that I see is important is I really do see the founding of Jamestown as the real start to the United States of America's history. And another place that people see as a benchmark, another time that people see as a benchmark is the landing on Plymouth Rock in 1620, 21, 22, somewhere around there, by the Pilgrims who came over from who came over from England. Well, actually, they went to Holland first, and then they went back to England and left. But they were escaping religious persecution because, you know, they were Puritans, you know. And the Jamestown colony eventually grew and became the Virginia colony, and Plymouth grew into the Massachusetts Bay colony. And all these colonies started popping up in North America under British rule. And there were also other players on the continent. There were Swedes around Philadelphia, but most notably were the Dutch up in New York, along the Hudson Valley, and of course the modern city of New York, which used to be New Amsterdam. And the Dutch have stamped their original legacy all over that city, and I mean, just the names Brooklyn and the Bronx and Yonkers, all these places are Dutch names. So, I mean, you have the 13 original colonies, which were from north to south, I guess. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And with the establishment of Georgia in 1720, something like that, you finally had all 13 original colonies, known collectively as British America. And let's see, where did I want to go next? Oh, I do want to mention that there was a great age of piracy at the time of the colonial period. It didn't just take place in the Caribbean. It was all there was also a lot of piracy going on along British America and you know, Spanish Florida. So, you know, anyways, I guess we'll just go right into the competing land claims between the French and the British. The French had established claims over the entire Mississippi River Valley from New Orleans to Minnesota to modern Pittsburgh. And they also had significant land up in Canada, famously Quebec, but also the Atlantic states of Canada. And the British wanted to gain control of it. The thing is, the French had a different way of doing things from the British. The French were there for purely economic purposes. They wanted to trade. They weren't interested in displacing the Indians. They weren't interested in founding towns and cities and moving tons of people there. They really just wanted to exploit the resources of the land and the waterways. But the British were looking to really dig in and start like a new space, a new lands for Britons to live, you know, like Lebensraum, you know. But eventually the French and the British butted heads, as they usually did in those days. And while the 7 Years' War was going on over in Europe, the real war in North America was called the French and Indian War, because the Indians joined in with the fight. Most Indians supported the French because they weren't there to settle and push the Indians out off of their lands, but the British had a couple Indians on their side as well. To make a long story short, the British won the war, and they pushed France out of the Ohio River Valley and completely west of the Mississippi. They now controlled all the way up to Minnesota, as well as all the French lands in Canada. Were now officially British territories. And it's kind of funny when you think about it. Quebec has such a strong French heritage, and still to this day a strong French language. But they haven't been French since like the 1760s or something like that. I think it was 1763. Whatever. So I guess we'll go from there into what happened because of the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. The British got themselves into some serious debt. And they had to find a way to pay it off somehow. They had to raise capital somehow. And they thought, well, we spent a lot of money to get these colonies over in the New World, so they're responsible to pay us back, so we can pay off the debts that we incurred to acquire those colonies and to protect those colonies. And the colonists were not fond of this because they didn't have representation in the British Parliament. And you see, back in those days, it was just the way government was done was so different. Democracy, modern democracy, wasn't really so much of a thing. I mean, the Dutch had a republic, and yeah, the Britons had parliament, but really they could kind of do, as long as they all agreed, they could really do whatever they want, no matter what the people had to say. I mean, yeah, that's kind of still how it is nowadays, but at the time it was even more so. And yeah, the idea of no taxation without representation is a big idea, and I'm not saying the Americans were the originators of such a notion. I mean, the French Revolution in world history, I think, was probably more significant because that was actually an overthrowing of a real monarch. But the American Revolution happened before. And it also kind of gave the French ideas that they could do something like this. So, you know, I think it's a pretty significant world event. It began, the war itself began in April of 1775, up in Massachusetts, of course, where the cause for liberty, as we call it nowadays, the cause for liberty was the strongest, you know, with the Boston Tea Party and the tragedy of the Boston Massacre. And the growing sentiment against British rule really came on slowly and wasn't felt everywhere all at once. And we were already well into the Revolutionary War before most Americans were really on board. But once the war was really underway, I mean, there was no choice. You had to join in. And of course, the first big event of the Revolutionary War was, you know, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, which is why this day is celebrated. And basically telling the British, we're no longer going to be ruled by you because you have shown through your intolerable administration of these colonies that you do not respect our liberty, and therefore we have every right as a free people to establish our own republic. And that's just what they did. I mean, the Revolutionary War was not a war that should have been won. We were definitely helped out by the fact that there was a big-ass ocean between us. But even then, it was still less likely that we would have won that war. But the Americans stuck to it, and they wore the British down, and the British eventually realized that got to the point where it wasn't worth the trouble. It wasn't worth wasting even more money, and the colonies weren't productive enough to really legitimize the idea that they should keep fighting. So by 1781 they gave up and formally surrendered. And I think 1783 was when the treaty was signed. But the United States now was free to organize themselves, and I think this is really interesting. It's something that doesn't happen a lot in history, where a group of people can come to a brand new land, and you know, they have to push aside the people that are there, but when they do, just start a country from scratch, you know, with modern ideals, you know, and that's pretty crazy, and it's not something that it's something that might not ever happen again, you know, given the way the world is now, unless an apocalypse happens and humanity starts over, which is possible. But yeah, it's pretty awesome. At first, we didn't have the Constitution from the beginning, of course. It started with the period in the 1780s with the Articles of Confederation, which weren't really that strong, and they didn't give the federal government any power. It wasn't really a federal government, in the modern sense. It was really just the states were, every colony had now become their own state, and which usually means nation state. And they were kind of governing themselves, and there were only very limited things actually connecting them and regulating them. They were very, very mostly free to make their own decisions, but it was eventually decided that that really wasn't enough. So the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787 first? Yeah, 1787 I want to say. And there they came together, representatives from every state, and they argued it out, and they made compromises, and they decided to be as conservative with the way they would write their Constitution as possible, and they came up with a limited Constitution. I've talked about the Constitution before and how much I like it, so I'll just go right on ahead to the next thing, which was the election of their first president, George Washington, in 1708 and 1789. It took a little while to get that election all together, and not even every state had actually ratified the Constitution at the time. It wasn't until 1791 when at last Rhode Island became the last of the 13 colonies to ratify the Constitution, at a time when George Washington was already president. So at the beginning, the federal government wasn't really all that strong, but a split began to take place in the 1790s, and this is where political parties come from. Washington stayed out of the political party thing, but two sides did form within the Congress, and it was the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists later on became the Republicans, which is what they were called at the time, but nowadays we refer to them as the Democratic Republicans, so as to avoid confusion with the modern Republicans, which wouldn't come about for many decades later. So yeah, Federalists and Republicans, Democratic Republicans, we should call them. And the big issue, of course, was over just how much control and power the federal government should have. And the Federalists argued that they liked the federal state structure of a country like Britain. Yeah, they'd broken off from them, but that was because they weren't getting the representation that they deserved. Now that they had the representation, they could continue that form of government that they did believe in and did believe worked, where the people in the capital had the control over what happened within the country itself, regardless of what the individual states thought should happen. The Anti-Federalists did not think so. They did like the idea of a union, and they did like the idea of some control over the states, but they really wanted the states to have more independence and more say in deciding their future and how things should be run. And this was kind of where the North-South split began to take place already in those times. The Anti-Federalist and later Democratic Republicans states were largely in the South, and the Federalists were largely in the North. So there was already a geographical split between the colonies before the Revolution, and it didn't go away with the creation of the United States of America. It only just continued, really. Intensified, really. Because now we've created our own thing, You may argue with your girlfriend every now and then, but once you're kicked out of your parents' house and you're living with your girlfriend, well, now the differences between the two of you are more apparent. Anyways, Washington didn't really do much in his presidency. A couple states were added on quickly after Rhode Island became a state officially. Kentucky joined in 1792. Big deal. They're the first state west of the Appalachian Mountains. And then a couple years later in 1796, Tennessee. Washington served 2 full terms and then decided to step down, which is a good thing. Kind of set a precedent that the new president wasn't going to be a king. He wasn't going to be somebody who'd be in there till he died. And ever since then, every president has respected that 2-term limit. That wasn't official at first, but became official later, except Franklin Roosevelt. We'll get to him. Now, Washington had been elected unanimously by the Electoral College both times. So 1796's election was the first one that was really contested. John Adams did win it. And the thing about John Adams, man, is he was a great man. He was a great politician. As far as figures in American history go, he was an important one, and he was definitely just an important guy. But as a president, he wasn't quite that good. I don't like the Alien Sedition Act, which was basically anybody who, or anybody who published something bad about the administration could end up in jail for it. That's, ooh. I mean, we just did the Bill of Rights. We just did the First Amendment the same decade. So it's kind of, it's easy to see why Jefferson, who was vice president, by the way, despite the fact that they were opposite political parties, but back then, whoever came in second place in the presidential election would be the vice president, which is wonderful. And I kind of wish it was still like that. Like, could you imagine if Hillary Clinton had been Donald Trump's vice president, or if Donald Trump was Joe Biden's vice president? Woo. Anyways. Jefferson comes to power, and Jefferson was a good president, and definitely also a very significant member of the Founding Fathers Club, And he had a couple achievements. The most famous one was the Louisiana Purchase, which was all the French land west of the Mississippi. Now, the thing about the Louisiana Purchase was actually a little bit more convoluted, because after the French and Indian War, while the French lost the land east of the Mississippi in Canada to the British, they actually also lost their land, all their North American land. They lost their land west of the Mississippi to the Spanish. But I forget how, but the French had got it back off of the Spanish, but the French even then realized that at that point Napoleon was in power, and it was kind of like they realized that they needed to focus on things more on the continent, and now that they had very limited access to the world ocean, all they had was New Orleans. They didn't really have any real reason to keep those lands west of the Mississippi. It wasn't doing them much good anymore, so it was worth selling them to the Americans, and the Americans definitely were interested in buying them. So that was definitely a good way to go. And of course there was the Lewis and Clark expedition, a wonderful, wonderful thing. The idea, by the way, wasn't to discover like the Pacific Ocean. That had long been known of. The Oregon Country was already kind of a thing, and it was kind of a shared thing between the British and the Americans that had to get sorted out later. But what Lewis and Clark were trying to do was just simply find a feasible overland route using as many navigable waterways as possible to go from the east of the United States to the Pacific Ocean. And they achieved it. They went and they came back. And that was an important moment in American history as well. because westward expansion was about to become a big deal. The only state to come into being during Jefferson's presidency was Ohio in 1803, formed out of the Northwestern Territories, which had kind of been established in the 1780s. And I guess we'll move right into Madison, who was Jefferson's successor, also a Democratic Republican. And at this point, the Federalists were starting to get boxed out of politics. They were really only predominant up in New England, and even then it wasn't reliable that they would get votes there. They could get some votes in the middle states, in the New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland area. Even then, not so much. The Democratic Republicans were really starting to squeeze out the Federalists, even in Madison's time. The big significant event of Madison's period was definitely the War of 1812, which was a renewed war against the British. There was some disputed territory in Canada, and really the United States, even though Britain had recognized their independence, Britain wasn't respecting American independence. You see, the biggest issue was, of course, the seizure of American ships and American sailors and impressing them, which means forcing them to serve for the crown. The Americans weren't having any of that. So they went to war with the British again, and this time the British didn't do as badly as they had done the first time. People say that the Americans lost. Other people say not really. Not many people argued that the Americans won, but I'd say it was definitely a failure, if not a defeat. The United States tried to seize control of Canada, which, if they had, imagine how different history would be. But they didn't. They failed. And the British managed to capture the capital. They stormed into the Capitol, they burnt down the White House, and the president had to flee. I mean, that's a victory. It's hard to argue against that. But there was one man who had a victory in that war. Colonel Andrew Jackson, down in New Orleans, man. The British decided, you know something? They only just purchased this land west of the Mississippi not too long ago. They just took a hold of New Orleans. You know, this kind of area is ripe for the taking. It's an excellent port, and it's entry into the whole interior of the continent. Like, this is a good opportunity we can take here. We can take advantage of here, and Colonel Jackson shut him down, man. You know, famously in the Battle of New Orleans. Well, the War of 1812, it did end quickly. It lasted from 1812 to 1814, but Madison decided to do the right thing, just like Washington and Jefferson had done, and leave after 2 terms. And then came Monroe. Now, with Monroe, you really have the death of the Federalists. Again, Monroe, another Democratic Republican from Virginia, 3rd one in a row. And the Federalists are just dying, and they're pretty much gone. There's no Federalists left by the 1820 election, where to the point where James Monroe is basically being elected unanimously, and one of the electors decides, just to make sure Washington can be remembered as the only unanimously elected president, he gives one of his votes to some other guy, just to make sure that it doesn't. Just to make sure that James Monroe doesn't also get that distinction, which I like. And this time period is known as the era of good feelings, because there was only one party in the United States. One party rule in the United States, and it hasn't been like that ever since then. And really, I don't think it could have lasted very long, because the differences between North and South didn't go away. So, you know, it was just the Democratic Republicans had just had success after success, and people liked their presidents and their policies. that all changed. In the election of 1824. Now, people talk about important elections, and every election, the politicians will tell you that this is the most important presidential election. In the history of presidential elections, there are significant ones for sure, lots of them. 1824 is up there. Not the most significant, but it's like top 5. It's a huge deal. There wasn't a clear successor to James Monroe when he left. And there were kind of different ideas about how the country should be run now. It was a 4-way split between, William Crawford and Henry Clay, I think, were the 2 minor candidates, but the major candidates were John Quincy Adams, Massachusetts guy, son of President John Adams, and really, even though the Federalists were gone and he was under the Democratic-Republican Party, really still kind of believed and held true to the died out to the extinct Federalist tradition. And Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the war hero of 1812. And Jackson was just a different type of guy, man. He was born in the interior of the country. He was born in a place that was kind of remote to the point where it's argued whether he was actually born in North Carolina or South Carolina. It was somewhere on the border, somewhere in the border. Nobody can be really sure. But he was just a different kind of politician. Let's just say that he was not well educated. He was not refined. He was not from the gentleman class. He was a self-made man who made his own way in life, who was very much a man of the people and a popular guy. And he received most of the votes from the people in the states. And he received most of the electoral votes as well. But he didn't get a majority because of that 4-way split. So the election went to the House of Representatives, as it says in the Constitution. And the House of Representatives, they didn't like that unruly Jackson. So they went with Quincy Adams. And Jackson was slighted. He was slighted. He really is like a figure probably who had a similar attitude to Donald Trump. Like imagine if Trump had won more electoral votes and more popular votes than his competitor, but because of some weird rule had not won the election. Imagine how flamed, how fired up he would be. That was Jackson in the 1820s. And John Quincy Adams, again, just like his dad, excellent politician, marvelous statesman, had amazing ideas, was super influential, was well respected, was a great freaking guy, and a significant figure. Not a great president, only lasted 1 term. Because you bet your ass in 1828 Jackson was back with an effing vengeance. And he came into power as the first Democratic president. At the time in the mid 1820s, the Democratic Republicans had split along Jacksonian or anti-Jacksonian lines, and the Jacksonians formed into the Democrats for the 1828 election, and ever since then we've had the Democratic Party. It's the same one we have now, and all founded by Jackson. And I guess the reason that the Democrats are represented by a donkey is because Jackson was called a jackass as like a derisive nickname. So, a jackass is a donkey. So that's why they're the animal that represents the Democrats. Now, let me think. Oh, and the anti-Jacksonians would later form the Whigs within within the time period of Jackson's administration. That's where the Whig Party came about. Which wasn't a long-lasting party, but they kind of brought back the old Federalist ideas that had died out, and they were kind of like they're the people who stuck beside John Quincy Adams, even with the new surge in popularity for Jackson. Big things were happening at Jackson's time, including the issue of the National Bank, which had kind of been an unresolved issue ever since the beginning of the country. You see, Alexander Hamilton, who I didn't talk about, but he was, I believe he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. That was Albert Gallatin. No, he was the AG. I don't know. He was in Washington's cabinet, and he was a significant early figure in America as well. He was considered one of the founding fathers. He was on the $10 bill because he was big into the monetary policy, and he wanted a federal monetary policy for the United States. He wanted a United States national bank to regulate the effing currency. Jackson didn't like that idea. Oh no. Jackson fought tooth and nail against the national bank because he was a states' rights type guy. He wanted the states to be able to regulate their own economies and even have their own currencies. I mean, the colonies had all had their own currencies, and in the early days the states had their own currencies. The establishment of the United States dollar was not really as strong in those days. And even more monetary control over the economics, the trade, of each state by a federal body, by a bank. Jackson hated the idea, loathed the idea, and that was one of the founding principles of the Democratic Party, was no national bank. Period. The other thing Jackson was into was expansion. He wanted to get more settlers into the rural parts of the original colonies and into the new states that were forming. Which, by the way, I forgot to talk about a couple of them. 1812, Louisiana became a state during the war after the Louisiana Purchase. Then we had a bunch of states in a row every year during the Monroe presidency, the Madison and Monroe presidency. 1816 would have been Indiana, 1817 Mississippi, 1818 Illinois. No, that's wrong. That's wrong. 1817 Mississippi, 1816 Mississippi, 1817 Indiana, 1818 Alabama, 1819 was Illinois, 1820 Maine became a state, broke off from Massachusetts, and in 1821 Missouri became a state. Okay. And then later in the 1830s, when Jackson and Van Buren were president, you got Arkansas in 1836 and Michigan in 1837, I believe. But yeah, Jackson was into expansion, and he knew that the Native Indians, the Indian Americans, the Native Americans living in the lands needed to get moved out of the way. So Jackson decided to expel the Cherokees from the Carolinas, famously in the Trail of Tears, which was the path, the long walk, the long march that the Cherokees were forced at gunpoint to take from the Carolinas to Oklahoma in huge numbers, and many of them died along the way. And Congress didn't even approve of it. The Supreme Court shot the decision down, but Jackson didn't care. Jackson looked at the Supreme Court and said, "You and what army? I'm the commander-in-chief." And he took that army and he sent him and he removed those Cherokees. That's a power move, man. I mean, whew. Could you imagine a president taking control of the army and contravening the direct orders of Congress and the Supreme Court? I mean, whew. That's a man who wasn't, he wasn't a Federalist, Jackson. Oh no. Oh no. There were many Indian wars going on at the time, of the 1810s, 20s, and 30s. One man would make a name for himself in the Indian Wars. His name was William Henry Harrison. He had the nickname Tippecanoe, which was actually the name of one of the Indians that I think he had fought against. But Tippecanoe was definitely a big, even though he put on the hard scrabble, raised a born in a log cabin image that Jackson actually had, that was genuine with Jackson. He kind of put it on. He was more of an upper class guy he was from Ohio, but not from a poor family in Ohio. And he tried to take on Van Buren in 1836. It didn't work out so well for him because I think 1836, if I'm not wrong, I might be wrong, was the year where the Whigs decided, well, we don't really have the majority, but maybe if we split the vote 100 ways, we can get it to the House so that they'll vote us in, and try to use the John Quincy Adams method again. So there were like 4 Whig candidates, but it didn't work. It didn't work. It failed. Martin Van Buren got elected. I'm pretty sure that was in 36. I might be wrong. It was either then or in 44. One of those two. I get them confused. But Van Buren came to power. Van Buren's significant for being Dutch. That's pretty cool. New York. He's a New Yorker. He grew up in a Dutch-speaking household from Kinderhook, New York. Kinderhook, And the other cool thing about Martin Van Buren was, what was it? He was really like he was kind of the new generation of politician. John Quincy Adams was a younger man, about the same age as Andrew Jackson, but they came from a different generation from all the founding fathers. Even James Monroe was kind of a fossil. They were kind of the new age, but Martin Van Buren was really the beginning because I remember now, he was the first president who was actually born in the United States of America. Now, all the other presidents were born in America, but they were born in British America. Martin Van Buren was born in the United States. So, that's an interesting fact. We'll go right on. Tippecanoe comes back in 1840, and people, Van Buren had ridden on the popularity of the Jackson platform and the Democratic Party, but people weren't too pleased with Van Buren's presidency. So by the time Tippecanoe came storming in, William Henry Harrison of the Whigs, 1840 he gets elected. 1841 he becomes president. Like a month or so later he dies. I feel so bad for the Whigs because when they get a president, he just effing dies. When they finally get the guy they like, they finally get the situation in the country they like, they finally get a good election, dead. John Tyler takes over as president. And, that's the first time a president has died in office, and it wasn't really set in stone that the vice president should immediately take over as president upon the death of the president. It was already in the Constitution, I'm pretty sure, but to actually see it carried out in practice, yeah, that kind of helped solidify the Constitution a little bit to say, well, the president may be dead, but we got the backup in place. We got the vice president. So yeah, Tyler was the first president not to be elected, and he would not be the last. 1844 election comes around. It's kind of it's more of a Tyler isn't really that popular, and the Whigs finally have had their chance at government. They lost their guy, and they lost the people. James Polk was sort of a young guy, sort of a new guy on the scene, and he was very much in the Jacksonian tradition. He was much more like Jackson, even than Van Buren had been. and he had more of that same upbringing. I think he was actually from Tennessee, so I think he's the first president west of the Appalachians. No, Harrison was from Ohio, but yeah, he's a significant figure, and a lot of stuff happened in his time, thanks to a war that took place. Up to this point, I got up to Michigan, so up to this point, Texas had kind of been a Mexican state. It was really part of Mexico, but there was significant settlement by white Americans, and they were kind of pushing out the Mexicans in the same way that the Mexicans had pushed out the Indians before them. So I mean, there were Mexicans, there were Indians, and now there were whites down in Texas, and the white Texans got together and decided, and they liked and they sympathized much more with the United States than with Mexico. So, they rebelled, and there was a Texas Republic. And shortly after that, they realized that they didn't have the full resources to protect themselves from Mexico, so they got on board with the United States and came into the Union in 1845. The same year, Florida, as Texas, Florida also became a state. I think Florida was an American colony, I believe, since the War of 1812. I think Spain basically, they basically just took it from Spain, and Spain didn't defend it. But I know it had to be since the War of 1812, because Jackson was the first territorial governor of Florida before he was president. So yeah, we get the Mexican-American War, which is basically Texas is now under the United States' protection as a state, and Mexico wants Texas back. And the Mexican-American War was the big event of the time, and the United States declared war on Mexico. We've only formally declared war on so many countries, Britain being one of them, and then of course in World War I and World War II. But formal declaration of war against Mexico. Our neighbors to the south. We've fought them before. Kicked their asses, by the way. Texas was secured and safe as a part of the United States, and just for good measure, the United States grabbed a hold of all of the Southwest, man. A huge portion of land, the modern states of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California, largely. All now a part of the United States of America, for us to make as many territories out of as we chose. And truly at this point we went from sea to shining sea. I mean, we had some claim over the Oregon Territory, and there were settlements up there already, but now with the Gadsden Purchase later on in the 1850s and a couple of treaty resolutions with the British, basically the as they call it, the contiguous United States, which doesn't include Alaska or Hawaii, was established, and the territory was there, and it was ours to do with it as we saw fit. Now you might think Polk would get reelected, but Polk didn't run again, and that doesn't happen a lot in American history, where a president goes for one term, does a good job by most people's reckoning, but then doesn't run again. He stepped down. I love that. I wish more people would do that. I wish more politicians would not be greedy and try to go for two, but would just say, I'm going to get in there, maybe promise on their first campaign that they won't go for re-election, and just say, I'm going to get in there, I'm going to do the best job I can, I'm going to get right the heck out. They don't have to worry about re-election from me. But anyways, this was a good opportunity for the Whigs to get in and take advantage now that Polk was out. And they chose rightly. They realized that splitting the vote doesn't work, but maybe we'll go for another Jacksonian type figure. We'll go for a guy, Zachary Taylor. He's a general who, had some great victories under his belt in the Mexican-American War. I think he'll be a good pick. So they go with Zachary Taylor, and Taylor, I mean, he has a similar upbringing to Jackson, but he doesn't quite have the attitude, and he's also apolitical. Taylor is not a political guy at all. Probably the least political of all presidents, if I really think about it. Yeah. He didn't really care. I mean, well, Eisenhower wasn't that political, but... So, there's your comparison. It was like an Eisenhower figure, where Eisenhower could have ended up with the Democrats or the Republicans. Taylor was like that, man. He could have went with the Whigs or the Democrats. But, he said in hindsight that he liked the Whigs' proposals more. Which is kind of funny. So, Taylor gets elected. 1849, the Whigs have a president again. They have another chance at government, and their president dies again. Oh! The Whigs have only elected 2 presidents, and both of them have died, and they've ended up with the B guy again, Millard Fillmore, who probably wouldn't have been a bad president in his own right, but he was too much of a waffler, wishy-washy type thing. In his time, though, a significant event in American history was the Gold Rush. Gold was discovered in Sutter's Mill, New York. I think it was 1849, 1848. It might have been discovered. It was 1849 was the year. No, it was 49. That was the year of the Gold Rush. The San Francisco 49ers, for a reason. And people started going out west, and California started to blow up. And it was previously just like an ex-Mexican land with not a lot of people in it. But now, make way! Here come the Americans, and they kind of, took a hold of the wealth, resources of the countryside. A lot of people got really rich, and but a lot more people didn't got nothing for their efforts. But that is it. So now there's so the thing is that not only do you have to have a couple things. Number one, you have to have the land to be able to go out and expand into. You see, because you're not just going to go west because you can. You have to have a reason, right? You have to have, not only you have to have the land, you also have to be able to have the resources to even make the journey, but you have to have the motivation. There has to be a reason to get you out west, to get people to settle into these new lands. So you need these things, you know what I mean? And the Gold Rush was one such motivation. And you also had California, because it grew so fast in 1850, it became a state. Also Wisconsin and Iowa had become states, and 46 for Iowa, 48 for Wisconsin, and 50 for California. I should mention Wisconsin and Iowa's becoming states. But yeah, California became a state in 1850, and completely disconnected from the entire rest of the United States, out there on the Pacific coast. It was already a state. A massive state, but they didn't realize just what they had done by creating such a state at the time, but it made sense at the time, okay? Then we go into the 1850s. Franklin Pierce is president. I don't really feel like talking about him. New Hampshire. I guess we have to start talking about slavery now. I haven't mentioned the word, but yeah, it's been going on for a while at this point. I mean, the Atlantic slave trade started with the Portuguese back in the 1500s. 1400s, 1500s, I think as early as the 1400s there was... it had started a long time before And it had always been a thing in America. Even in the North, there were slaves until around the time of the Revolution, when Massachusetts, they didn't. I'm not so convinced that the states of the North were had such great morals and were so, beautifully and more wonderfully enlightened than the landowners in the South as to the plight of the poor black man. I don't believe that story. I really do think it was just straight up economics. I mean, even now, Northern people now act like they're better because we didn't own slaves, Motherfucker, you did when you could. You did when you could, and then when you realized it wasn't really profitable, and you were more about industry anyways, and there's not a lot of agriculture going on, especially in New England anyways, compared to what's happening down south. No. But it was a huge issue, because while you have the expansion of the United States of America and its people into the West, and again pushing the pushing aside of the Indians, you also have an issue come up of whether in these new lands there should be slavery. Because, it wouldn't have been an issue if the states of the North hadn't taken a stance against it and hadn't outlawed it. But the states in the South, not only was it legal, it was like almost mandatory with the way they were doing business. So, they had... it was contentious, and it also kind of came down to the states' rights issue, where it was kind of an issue of, well, the Southerners didn't mind that the Northerners banned slavery in their states, and they didn't see why the Northerners should mind that the Southerners allowed slavery in their states. They also didn't see why these new territories that were forming into states shouldn't have their own what word am I looking for? Shouldn't have their own power or ability to decide whether or not slavery should be in their new state. But the people who were anti-slavery didn't want new slavery in any state. And sure, there were abolitionists who thought that slavery should be banned even in the states even in the South where it already existed. But they were extremists. Of course, the other extremist position was that slavery should be expanded into every new place, regardless of what the people there think. But the moderate position at the time, which was usually the ones that the presidents held, presidents like Franklin Pierce and his successor James Buchanan, was basically, when a new state comes up, we'll just have them vote on whether or not they want slavery, and if they vote no, no; if they vote yes, yes, whatever, and we'll just push the issue aside and let the country be half slave and half free. It seemed like the smart move at the time, because you couldn't really side with one or the other, because you wouldn't get elected, And James Buchanan, oh man. By the way, Franklin Pierce was the first president. He was a one-term president, but he was the first president who tried for renomination by his own party and was not renominated. Even his own party didn't really like the job he did. Bad for him, man. Imagine if Obama had said, I'll be running again for election in 2012, and the Democratic Party said, nah, didn't renominate him. Whew. So, 56, election comes, and it's James Buchanan, and Sadly, James Buchanan is the only president from my home state of Pennsylvania. And he was a terrible president, possibly the worst. On an unrelated note, he might have been gay. There's significant evidence. It was like in the form of like love letters that he had written with a pal of his that seemed very intimate. But you know, I mean, and he was also, and there's also the fact that he never married and never had any kids. It does make it look that way. Not that it matters whether or not he was really gay. He certainly wasn't openly gay. And there are other presidents too that have had the gay rumors about them, even ones that have had wives and children. So Buchanan, it's easier to buy, but nah. It's a shame Buchanan couldn't have been. I think if Buchanan had served, this is just me defending him because he's from Pennsylvania. I think if Buchanan had served in a more united and less divided period of American history, he would have been a better president. He would have been all right. That's my opinion, though. Everything was coming to a head, man. A few more states added on: 1858, Minnesota; 1859, Oregon. But 1860, there's an election. Now, you want to talk about significant elections in American history? Well, I do, for some reason. 1824 was top 5, you know, in there. I'll mention them when I come across them, but the most important election, presidential election, the really important presidential election, 1860. And it's another 4-way, just like it was in 1824, except for different reasons. The situation in Congress was coming to a head. More and more new territories were added on. Minnesota and Oregon and California were all free states. Kansas was this territory that was really looking to become a state, and there was some trouble happening in Kansas. Most of the people there wanted it to be a free state, but the ruling parties, the powers that be, wanted to make sure it became a slave state, you know. I mean, the issue had gone back to, like, you know, Missouri. Like, you know, Missouri was a slave state, even as far north as it was. But, you know, with the Missouri Compromise, the idea was that Missouri will be a slave state, but any state north of Missouri, of the southern border of Missouri, which would be like, you know, the border between Kansas and Oklahoma, or the border between Colorado and New Mexico, that parallel, the 40th parallel, I think it is, would be the line where no new slavery north of the state, but north of that line. But Pierce, back in his term, had repealed the Missouri Compromise, so now Kansas was again able to become a slave state if it wanted to. So, you know, this issue wasn't going to sort itself out. And it had been around. It had been with the country its entire history. It was an issue in the colonial days. It was an issue during the Revolution with, I mean, a lot of people in the South didn't want to join the Revolution because they didn't want to lose their slaves. The British Empire kind of protected their slavery, you know. And it was an issue in the Constitution, big time. When it came down to how many how many representatives each state should have, it was decided that oddly enough, the North didn't want the black citizens to count because they didn't want the Southern states to have more representative power. But the Southern states wanted the black citizens that they kept as slaves to count as citizens so they could get more representation. So that was the 3/5 compromise, where it's in the Constitution and had to be repealed later. Amended later. The that each slave, it didn't say black, it was each person within servitude, because there were free blacks, would count as essentially 3/5 of a citizen. They say 3/5 of a person, but it's 3/5 of a citizen. Every 5 would count as 3. See, these kind of like little compromises and stalling tactics, they didn't last. What was it I said in the beginning about not rambling? Oh God, I haven't even gotten to the Civil War. Let's get to the Civil War. We all know what happened. 1860, split ticket for the Democrats. Stephen Douglas in the North, John C. Breckinridge in the South. The Republican Party had formed in 1856. Their first candidate was John C. Fremont, but the party was too new. The Whig Party fell apart, and the Republicans kind of were the phoenix that rose out of their ashes. And yes, they are the modern Republicans. So now we have the Democrats and the Republicans that have lasted ever since, that are still around. And the Republicans were basically founded as the new radical kind of abolitionist party that said, you know what, no more slavery. We're taking a stand. And people in the South, they weren't quite so worried about like a Whig president, but man, they really did not want an abolitionist president. They lost the election because the Democrat vote split. If Stephen Douglas had gotten the support of the southern states, they might have won the election. And the issue would have been the can would have been kicked down the road even further somehow. But they decided to stick with John C. Breckinridge, who was more adamant in defending slavery. And there was even a fourth guy, John Bell, who started just the Constitution Party, who said all this division is madness. He said, I'm going to start the Constitutional Union Party, which their entire platform was just keep the country united. Slavery or no slavery, keep the country united. They picked up a couple states, but despite the split ticket, despite 4, major options, Lincoln won the election. He won the electorate, and he had enough. Even though he was only elected in the northern states, he had enough electoral votes to get in there and be president. It was all over at that point. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, and all the other southern states followed, 11 in total. Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas all seceded. A couple states that did have slavery, known as the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, and Delaware too, remained in the Union. But it was tense there, and it was touch and go, depending on how the war went, with whether they would stay in the Union. And I won't go too into the Civil War. The big turning point was the Battle of Gettysburg, and also coincidentally at the same, the Battle of Gettysburg, which kept the Confederate forces, that was the new country that was formed, the Confederate States of America. They kept the Confederate rebel forces from advancing any further north and kept them fighting on their own territory permanently for the rest of the war. And then also, of course, Vicksburg, with thanks to General Grant. I mean, it was a big deal happening at the same time as Gettysburg, July of 1863, where he managed to crush the last holdout on the Mississippi River of Confederate forces, so that now the Union controlled the entire Mississippi River. That was that had been a great asset for the Confederates to keep a hold of the mouth of the Delta region, But it didn't matter for trade though, because the Union blocked them. had a naval blockade around the entire South. And but now with the loss of the Mississippi River, the South was split in twain, and Texas stayed rebellious, and there were wars and there were battles going on out in New Mexico, even, which the New Mexico territory, which the Confederates had claimed. But I don't know. After Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it was all downhill. 1865, the war finally comes to a close. Meanwhile, in '64, Lincoln does get reelected. People do like how the war is running. It is running way too long, though. But the aims of the two different sides were different. I mean, the Union had to, in order for the Union to win, they had to bring the South to its knees. They had to bring the Confederacy to its knees. They had to wreck them and make them beg to come back. Whereas the Confederacy were just trying to hold out. They actually, I mean, while they didn't have as many people and resources and all that, they had the easier goal of simply just holding out, just holding the fort. They were the fort that had to be seized, and the Union had to do the seizing. But the siege was successful, and the Confederacy lost, and they lost big time. And it was bad for the South, man. It was bad for the South. Their economy had to be restarted from square one, man. They had their own thing going on, and now they had to try something else. Slavery was abolished. A couple big amendments came through Congress, not only abolishing slavery, but also making freed slaves citizens. And also ensuring and protecting their right to vote. I mean, all at once. These are the acts of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction refers to those amendments as well as to the time period of the late 1860s into the 1870s in which the Union became whole again as the southern states joined back in with the Union. But Abe Lincoln wouldn't live to see the Reconstruction. He was assassinated very shortly after the war officially was surrendered. And yeah, that was a big deal. John Wilkes Booth assassinated him. He was the first president to be not only die in office, he was the third president to die in office, but the first president to be killed in office, to be murdered. But, now we go into, Andrew Johnson, who was his vice president, wasn't a Republican, he was a Democrat. But they ran together under the Union Party as kind of a, support the war effort type thing. But Andrew Johnson, man, this is a bad president. They tried to impeach him. They did impeach him, but they didn't kick him out of office. I think it's by one vote. He stayed in office by 1 vote, I think. I think he barely survived. And might have been the first president to be kicked out of office. Then we have Grant. I like Grant. General Grant. Very successful in the war. He's considered the counterpart to Robert E. Lee, the greatest general of the South. But he had to prove himself on the battlefield to reach that status, and he did. General Grant was a great general, and pretty freaking good president, and he pushed the Reconstruction policies hard on the South and kind of forced them to reform, and maybe a little too harshly, as the Democrats would go on to argue. But it was at this point that you had very strongly a Democratic South and a Republican North. Very strongly. And that's kind of how it shaped up just for the start of the Civil War, and it would stay that way. Now out west, things were different. When it was just Democrats and Whigs, the new colonies would... the new states would just generally default to Democrat, which is why the Democrats won so many more elections. But now, with the newest Western states, they might go Republican every now and then, or they might go Democratic. You didn't really know for sure. In the 1860s, the new states added were in 1861 you had Kansas finally became a state. In the midst of the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War, in the midst of the Civil War, West Virginia actually broke off from Virginia. So aside from Maine, they're the only two states that broke off from another state. And but it was even crazier because it was in the middle of a war against Virginia. West Virginia, which didn't have a lot of slavery anyways, their geography isn't good for large-scale agriculture anyways. They broke off and joined the Union as their own state in 1863, and I'm kind of glad that West Virginia is its own state. I would hate for all those people to be ruled by one massive government in Richmond. I like that the Appalachians has its own, that there's a quintessentially Appalachian state, you know. And then 1864, Nevada became a state, the third western state, Pacific state, you know. Well, the first state that didn't border the Pacific Ocean or the rest of the United States. But they had like a silver boom and gold boom up in the Carson City area. And then the last state of the 1860s was Nebraska in 67, which, you know, there's nothing I have to say about Nebraska at all. I will take the opportunity to say that I think, and this is just be an interesting experiment, that the capital should be moved from Washington, D.C. to Lincoln, Nebraska, and it should become the new capital of the United States. It's just a crazy idea of mine. It's centrally located, and it's also named after a president who, by the way, Lincoln, I think was the best president, and I think was probably my favorite president, and he's definitely been my favorite president when I was a kid. He probably still is. I think he still is. He's the best president and my favorite president. And, you know, so I think a centrally located capital named after a president even greater than Washington wouldn't be a bad idea. That's my stupid idea. Anyways. The 1870s, the Democratic Party had to recover, man. They had to. There were southern states that were voting Republican, which was insane. Well, that's because so many black people were voting. There were black people voting. I don't know about so many, but there were. And 1876 was a big election. I said I'd point them out when I got to them, and there's one. It was a big election with Samuel Tilden of the Democrats versus Rutherford B. Hayes of the Republicans. And, you know, there had been pretty solid Republican rule, and Reconstruction was over at this point, but there were still, like, Union soldiers and military guards down south to keep things, you know, in place. Samuel Tilden would probably win this election and reverse a lot of that. But of course the Republicans wanted to stay in power. So when it came down to the Electoral College, there were 3 states. I can't remember all of them, but I know Florida was one of them, that really could have gone either way. Except Tilden was already like on the cusp. Like, you need a certain number. Nowadays it's 270. Back then it was different. But you need a certain number to hit a certain number to be guaranteed. So he was right there about to be elected. And then a couple states come in at the last minute. 3 states that all could have went either way went to Hayes. And Hayes stole the majority of the votes and won the presidency for it. And it just didn't make it didn't make the Democrats happy to have that happen. I'm starting to lose my voice, man. I'm still in the 1870s, man. But this was called the corrupt. Okay. It was believed that what happened was that the electors in these states were paid off to basically turn the vote towards Hayes and allow him and the Republicans to have their presidency. But the Republicans would have to pull out of the South and end any remaining Reconstruction efforts and let the South run their business the way they wanted to run it. Yeah, it's fine to have a Republican president, but slavery's over, and sure, black people are citizens and they have the vote, but just get out of our business, North. We could let us run things the way we know how to run them down south. That's kind of how it happened. And this was called the corrupt bargain. And, Hayes lost the popular vote. So, apart from 1824, there's only been 4 times in history where the person who won the electoral vote didn't win the popular vote. So, 1876 is the first one of them. Yeah, that's basically it. Hayes would be kind of kicked out, or he decided not to run again. Instead, in place they had Garfield, who I really think would have been a good president, but he was assassinated in 1881. 1876, Colorado becomes a state. And he gets replaced with Chester Alan Arthur, not so great a president. By 1884, the Democrats are really sick of being out of power. Andrew Johnson was technically a Democrat, but not really. The last real Democratic president had been in 1860. It was now 1884, right? We're talking 24 years, which for us, imagine 1996 to 2020. Imagine imagine you're a 24-year-old. You're a grown adult living your own life, hopefully. Your whole life, the same party has been in power. A quarter of a century of power for one party almost. Something was it had to flip. You can't have that strong of a run. In a two-party system, one party cannot be in power for a quarter of a century without getting kicked out. Unless there's serious corruption happening, which, there kind of was. But by 1884, the Democrats have the Civil War behind them. They're running their southern states the way they like to run them, which means they're doing what they can to keep, black people from voting. And there's Jim Crow laws start. And, that's where the Jim Crow started, was in 1876 with the corrupt bargain. But a man named Grover Cleveland. It takes a Democrat from the North to get the Democrats back in power. From New York, from Buffalo, who was kind of a scummy, shady dealing guy. Fat man with a mustache. He's the one that that flips New York Democratic. New York was kind of a bellwether state too, by the way, in those days. But New York was really split Democratic Republican for most of its history. And what am I going to say about him? I don't know. The Democrats had this thing going on where a while ago, maybe a year ago, I was looking at the party platforms from history on some government website somewhere, and the Democrats of 1884 were steamed. Let's just say they were burnt about not having been in power for so long, and they blamed everything that was wrong with the country on the Republicans. And they really attacked and went after them and said, it was almost like a when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for free people to, that kind of thing. Like, it was like they were almost declaring independence from the intolerant, tyrannical Republicans. And Grover Cleveland offered an alternative, and he won. He was president for one term and then the 1888 election happens. Grover Cleveland, for the second time, this is the second time in American history it's happened, Grover Cleveland wins the popular vote, loses the Electoral College, and Benjamin Harrison, the Republican, is now the president. Now, you'll notice a trend here that every time the popular vote wins, but the Electoral College doesn't, every time the Republicans get in on Electoral College, it's the Republicans getting in. It's not the Democrats. It hurts the Democrats every time the popular vote doesn't win the presidency. So back in the 1870s and 80s it was like that, and it was like that in the 2000s and 2010s. Now, in Harrison's time, he added some significant number of states. In all this Republican time, not a lot of territory had actually been added to the United States. It had kind of reached its maximum with the Gadsden Purchase in the 1850s. But they did purchase Alaska in 1867. In 1867, they purchased Alaska off of Russia for famously like 2 cents an acre. But because Alaska was so huge, that was like millions of dollars. But even then, they considered it a worthy price. It was actually made fun of in the newspapers as a horrible waste of taxpayer money to buy this like frigid wasteland, vast wasteland in the middle of nowhere. But it might have been a good move. It still remains to be seen whether the purchase of Alaska was a good move. I mean, it's better we had it than the Russians, so yeah, okay, I guess it was a good move. But, so the Republicans were trying to make up for the lack of territorial additions to the Union, because I haven't mentioned the name before, but the expansion of American settlers into the West and the frontier is known as Manifest Destiny nowadays, and modern historians often criticize the idea of Manifest Destiny, that it was like it wasn't our God-given right to conquer the continent from sea to shining sea. Personally, I'm not like that. I don't think like that. I think Manifest Destiny was alright. I don't know if it was really their God-given destiny to conquer. But, I mean, if there is a God and there is a destiny, then it was their destiny. I mean... and they had made it manifest. I mean, it was true. I mean, and at the same time, I tend to think, like, with all of these like global conflicts of one people displacing another, I tend to think that the displacers win. If you take land, man, it's yours now. Finders keepers. I mean, I know. There's a lot of sour grapes out there for people who've lost land, like when the Irish lose Northern Ireland, or and I can feel some of it too. I can sympathize. Whenever you lose territory to somebody in a war or in an invasion, it's theirs now. Sorry. It's theirs. It's like the Israel-Palestine thing. I really shouldn't go into this. What the hell? I was going to go on a rant. Oh my god, I stopped myself. The point is, Manifest Destiny, I don't think was actually that bad of a thing. It was bad for the Native Americans, absolutely. But for the United States of America as a nation, it was a freaking wonderful thing. Now, thanks to all of this, we can get back to the topic. Many states came in 1889 and 1890, because up till now there was a gap between the all the cluster states to the east and the couple little states out west. Now, at last, not only was American territory connected from sea to sea, it was connected, the American states ran from sea to sea. In 1889, we gained North Dakota and South Dakota. They split up Dakota Territory into 2 states. And Montana, as well as, I always get this wrong, Wyoming. I'm almost certain. And then, or no, was it Washington? No, it was Washington. I always mix those two up. But in 1891, it was Idaho, which finally connected the 2 sides together. And I think Wyoming. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm certain now. In 89, it was Washington, Montana, the 2 Dakotas. And in 91, it was Idaho and Wyoming. Aside from adding states, I don't really know what the hell Harrison did in his presidency. He tried to run again. And Cleveland came back a 3rd time. Because he knew, because he could. And he felt cheated from that last election. And in 1892, he came back and he won. And served another term as president. And to this date, he is the only president to have served 2 non-consecutive terms. So far. It's something that you did that you wouldn't think could ever happen again. Especially now that with the 2-term limit and everything, and, you know, it could happen again. But the Democrats' seasons in the sun were over. 1896, Utah became a state. I didn't mention, before I get into the 1890s, I should mention the Gilded Age and unions and capitalists and so-called robber barons, and how there was now a new consciousness and a labor movement and all this. I don't really care. I don't know. Yeah, that was a thing. But yeah, coal miners and strikes and stuff like that. That was a big issue of the day. A progressive party actually formed to support the workers of America, and was kind of socialist. I mean, socialism was around at the time, but it was kind of socialist. It was kind of like more, and later on a socialist party, around that time a real socialist party would form. And they would run the same guy, Eugene V. Debs, for like 5 or 6 elections. But yeah, they were more about government, give us something. They started the whole handout thing, which would become a bigger deal later on. Woo! Okay, 1896, William McKinley gets elected president, instills a new confidence into a nation. Brought back kind of Americanism, and was done with all the partisan bickering of the Democrats and the Democrats. Republicans came back into power in a big way with McKinley, and McKinley was a good president who gets underwritten because his successor was so much better. But I like McKinley personally. We got into the Spanish-American War, where now we're fighting Spain over territories, basically, and we won. We got a hold of Cuba, which slipped away from us. We got a hold of the Philippines, which we kind of let go. And we got a hold of Puerto Rico, which we still hang on to for some reason. And we also picked up Hawaii. Interesting territory to have. Then 1900, McKinley gets reelected. 1901, the very next year, he's assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, the Hungarian anarchist. His vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, who wasn't that well known, all of a sudden is in the spotlight. And up till now, we've had, what, 4 presidents come into power without being elected? And every one of them has been terrible. Hasn't really run again. Hasn't done much with the opportunity of getting the presidency handed to them. Teddy Roosevelt was the first one. To really take advantage of being handed the presidency for free. There's a lot I can say about him. I like the guy. He's a good president. Everybody likes him. Liberals like him. Conservatives like him. He's a tough guy. A rich kid, but a very rugged explorer. He loved to hunt, but he also loved to preserve wildlife. Just an all-around American icon, you know, and he deserves his spot on Mount Rushmore. Yeah, definitely. But Teddy respected, at the time, the 2-term kind of precedent that had been set. Again, up till now, no president has, even though they could, no president has done more than 2 terms, or even run more than 2 terms, except for Cleveland, but you know. Anyways, he decides that he wants, that by 1908, that he's done enough. Built the Panama Canal. That's a big deal. So he wants out. Oh, I guess I should mention, Oklahoma became a state in 07. He wants out. He picks his successor, William Howard Taft, the fattest president. And, I don't know, even fatter and more mustached, and more finely mustachioed than Cleveland. But, yeah, he picks his Republican successor, William Howard Taft, and, I think Taft did a better job than people give him credit for. I don't know. Oh, by the way, Arizona and New Mexico became states in 1912. They're the last of the contiguous states to join the Union. Now we have the 48 states, and they would stay 48 states for a while. By 1912, though, Teddy Roosevelt has decided that he doesn't like the job that Taft did, and that he would be a better president, and that actually he thinks he should run again. He gets the Roosevelt itch and decides it's time to go for his 3rd term. And he runs again. Except the Republicans don't take him as their nominee. They like Taft. So now we have a split ticket. And this will be the last split ticket in a presidential election that wasn't a protest vote, because later on, a couple times, the South would vote for a couple states in the South would vote for somebody to oppose the National Democratic Party, but not as a protest vote, as a legitimate alternative candidate, a significant third-party candidate. It was the last third-party candidate to win electoral votes, like, you know, aside from the protest voters. In 1912, another big election in the history of presidential elections. And Roosevelt is so popular that he picks up quite a few states. He won Pennsylvania, my home state. And Taft only sneaks away with like 2 states. And he gets shafted. And because of the split, and because of the split Republican vote, the Democrats have it. And they win. Oh shoot. And they win. Now the angle changed, now the shot changed, whatever. And they win, man. It's insane. How do they do it? Woodrow Wilson, the president of Princeton University. He's president of the United States now. And boy, oh boy, is he a terrible president. I don't want to go into a rant about Wilson. I don't want to talk about how awful he is, his income tax. Or getting re-elected on the promise of not getting us into the war in Europe, and then immediately getting us into the war in Europe. I don't want to talk about the Wilson years. The 1910s had a lot of significant things happen for the country. You know, good old ragtime, America violating the beautiful Monroe Doctrine for the first time, and going to war in Europe. For some reason. I really don't know what reason. Like, what was our interest in that war? I mean, it's been explained to me, like, I've seen people argue that the United Kingdom shouldn't have gotten into World War I, but, I mean, they had some reason. I really do not see why the fucking U.S., why we went over there. But, man, when we decided to go to war, we went to war, man. It went from... It's very quickly, like, the pop songs of the day went from, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I never want to send him off to war, to the very next year, it was, Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun, Johnny, get your gun and be a soldier. Like, it was like immediately like, okay, now we're going to war. If we're going to war, we're going to war. No, I do think World War I was a mistake. For everybody involved, but especially the United States as well. And it set into motion some big events. There was a little pandemic, a little Spanish flu outbreak that was helped. That was helped along by World War I. Then called the Great War. But suffice to say, Wilson had to go. And people were kind of sick of the Democratic thing anyways. The Democrats were not popular. Republicans really dominated the country. The only way the Democrats got elected was because, well, they had all the South, but the South wasn't enough. It was if they got enough western states where they were able to peel away the border states. Maryland was a good bellwether. New Jersey was a bellwether. Ohio was a bellwether, as it kind of still is. Even New York, like, you could break into as a Democrat. But New England, Democrats weren't touching that. Well, give it some time and they will, but at the time, they were very Republican. As a matter of fact, the most Republican state in United States history is Vermont. Yeah, look it up. They've only ever had one Democratic senator. Okay, so as the 1910s draw to a close, two big issues are starting to that have been rearing their heads the past couple decades finally come to a head: prohibition and women's rights, and both of them succeed. I think in the year 1919, both of them, or 1920. In that time period, you have two big things. You have, well, the banning of the exportation, sale of liquor and beer, of all alcohol. Alcohol is illegal in the United States, except for like religious purposes. And that's a huge deal, as well as women get the right to vote. And it may seem strange now, but those issues were connected. The Prohibition movement was started by women, and it was strongly parroted by the earliest feminists. First wave feminists, as they're now known. you know, like, I don't know, Susan B. Anthony types, because it was seen as a domestic issue, the issue of alcoholism and how it negatively affected men and caused them to be abusive to their wives, or to neglect their kids, or to even neglect their work, or run off or whatever, and the negative bad influence it had in the men's life, in the life of the man, was seen as something that could ruin the life of a woman who, at that time, women really depended on men to be there as fathers and as husbands. And alcohol was a big weapon a big weapon that was used against them. So the two issues were connected, and they did come together, and were both passed in constitutional amendments protecting women's right to vote and banning alcohol. And then in 1920, with Harding comes into vote, and Warren Harding is nominated for the Republican Party, the newly reunified Republican Party, who are cursing themselves for having split the vote before. And there are people who threaten to split the vote even now. But they've come together under Harding, basically, who isn't really that much of a politician. Just kind of a compromise candidate between all the various factions at the convention. You know, in those days, conventions were so much more interesting than they are now. Now they're just kind of stupid. They're just different politicians from that particular party that just go up and make speeches, and then at the end, every state just basically calls out that they have their votes for, whatever candidate. Back then, man, it was a horse race, man. It was wrangling. Every state had their favorite son or their particular one that they liked, and a couple would group together and they would make compromises and deals with each other about what would happen in Congress, or what they would do if they got their guy in, or how they could help them today if they could get their nomination through. And there was all kinds of wrangling, and there were parties within parties, It was insane, and it would have really been interesting to watch such political wrangling in the televised age. But unfortunately, the televised age brought more homogenization, of the political parties, as they had to better distinguish themselves from each other. They united more within themselves. Anyways, Harding gets elected. Big election by like a landslide. He was very popular, especially with women who now could vote. And he was a controversial politician, because he wasn't really a politician. He was just kind of a little bit corrupt, and he gave government jobs to his buddies, as favors and stuff like that. Kickbacks and stuff like that. Coolidge being his vice president was really just kind of a quirk of history. They kind of threw him on the ticket there as like a kind of a gimme, everybody likes Coolidge, because they had such trouble. Because basically it was like a group of men, like in a room with cigars, who chose who would be president and vice president for their party. And they had taken so long to come up with Warren Harding as the strong presidential candidate that by the time it came time to choose the vice president, they're like, man, who do we have? Oh, we can't choose this guy because that'll piss off them. We can't choose that guy because it'll make those guys angry. Let's go with Coolidge. And they went with Coolidge because he was a guy that nobody was pissed off about. Everybody liked Coolidge. Nobody had a problem with him. And that was Coolidge as a politician, and as a senator, and as a state senator, and a governor, and as a president. Coolidge was well liked by everyone. Even Democrats would turn around and vote for Coolidge. So, unfortunately for Harding, he passed away, but fortunately for Coolidge, he got the chance to become president. And he's the president just like Roosevelt, who takes advantage of his coming into the presidency. And by the time 24 comes around, the Republicans are still the dominant party. Coolidge is well liked by the American public. They haven't even really heard of him unless you're from Massachusetts. But now that he's president and things are going well, they let Coolidge again. And I've read Coolidge's autobiography, and I like the guy. I really do. I think he's a swell guy. I love his politics, and I love the way he interacts with people. He is a politician that they don't make anymore. And I know people always have in their idea of what a good politician is. They say, well, they're all terrible, every one of them. But Bernie's my hero. Or they say, oh, they're all terrible, but I hate them all. But I like Ron Paul, for example. Coolidge was better than both of them. and at the time, politics was more corrupt than it is now. As hard as it is to believe, I really think it was. This guy was just so strong. He's known as Silent Cal because he didn't talk a lot. He was the real strong and silent type who was real just decisive and measured and never even breathed a bad word about his opponents. Didn't talk about them at all, actually. Just a consummate gentleman. I don't even know if they make people like this anymore, let alone politicians. And his politics, conservative as hell. I mean, dyed in the wool. Better to do absolutely nothing at all than to make any change that might be bad for the country. I like that kind of politics. I could get behind a guy like that, especially in a changing time. It's nice to think about what it would be like to have a president like Cal who just lets things run their course. And people criticize him for that approach nowadays, and people even blame the Great Depression that happened after he was president kind of on that attitude, on that laissez-faire kind of attitude, but nah, ain't his fault. While he was president, things were good. We had the Roaring '20s. Jazz had, was the jazz age, and Prohibition was in force, but everybody was ignoring it. And there were gangsters that were like Al Capone that came about. It was a different time. I didn't mention the Wild West at all, but there was the Wild West back in the 1880s. By 28, Coolidge did the right thing and decided to step down. And Herbert Hoover was a perfect successor for Coolidge. And he won. He won big by that. He won that election even bigger than Coolidge won it. And it was just really a shame what happened to him when he was president. Because he was a nice guy, and he would have been a good president if things hadn't gone belly up. But things went belly up. Stock market crashed in 1929, set into motion the Great Depression, which affected the entire world, and probably was the cause of World War II and the rise of the National Socialists. Like that was kind of happening already, but that was like the nail in the coffin. Anyways, it's probably the biggest event of the 20th century. It's hard to say for sure, but it's up there, man. The stock market crash in 1929, and the Great Depression is a big deal. People don't talk about it so much anymore. They always talk about World War II, but they kind of leave the Depression in the dust and don't really talk about it, but it was huge, man. It was everything. It changed society. I would argue that it was a more significant turning event, or turning period, because it lasted a decade, than like the 60s hippie revolution, cultural revolution and civil rights movements and war protests. All that stuff that came in the 60s didn't change society as much as the Depression. It maybe brought all of the resentments and hidden identities and things like that to the forefront, but the Great Depression is what fed those resentments, what bought those resentments, because it was already tough for blacks in America, but now it was unbelievably tough, and it was tough for most white people, it was tough for most rural people, for most farmers at this point, and now it was ungodly tough. It was unbelievably tough, and it was just a bad situation, man. And some monetary policy could have been put in place in the early years, in 30, 31, 32, that might have turned things around earlier, but it didn't happen, or what was done wasn't really enough. You see, at that point in history, the United States had already urbanized significantly. I mean, we're talking 100 years ago, but I think it was 1920 or 22. In that area, I don't remember where I heard this, but I heard that at that point in the early 20s, the United States was already more urban than rural, or I should say more people were living in cities than on farms already in the 1920s. So then when the Dust Bowl hit in the 30s, I mean, they needed a man to get them out of it. Franklin Roosevelt was just the guy. He had the Roosevelt name already, but he was a Democrat, and he had different policies, and he was a rich New Yorker, and he was liked. And the Republican era basically came to an end. From 1860 to 1932. 2 Democratic presidents in 72 years. Well, Andrew Johnson, make it 3, but I don't count Andrew Johnson. You shouldn't either. Yeah, the Republican era ended, and a new era began. An era of social reform and socialist economics and welfare, and helping out all those poor, impoverished people who need all that help, and creating jobs, which I have nothing against. The Works Progress Administration, Tennessee Valley Authority, or whatever, all that stuff. I got nothing wrong with that. A lot of people moved in the 30s. A lot of people got up and moved. A lot of the blacks after being freed from slavery stayed on in the South and continued to be what were called sharecroppers. We owned a portion of the land, but you kind of got screwed. A lot of them started to leave in the 30s. They started to leave the South and started moving into the northern cities like New York and Detroit and Chicago in big numbers. And a lot of people started to move in the 30s. The Dust Bowl kicked all the people out of Oklahoma. The Dust Bowl was basically like just the land had dried up. Poor land management caused the winds of the plains to just sweep away the topsoil, so that farmers that had previously had acres and acres and acres to grow on now had nothing. They were forced to move, and a lot of them moved out to California. And California, which had kind of cooled down quite a bit since the gold rush, was now starting to populate in a big way again. The movie industry was starting up. There were records now. People could listen to music at home, it's a big deal. And all kinds of other technologies I haven't mentioned, you know. Radio, for example, you know. But while the 30s was a hard time for most people, like, and it wasn't even really that much better in 36, or in 40 for that matter. It was a little better. They re-elected him, FDR, twice, in 36 and in 40. FDR was buddies with Winston Churchill, and they kind of had a relationship even before the war. Even before Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, actually. So I think FDR did want to help Winston Churchill in Europe. And he certainly did whenever World War II broke out in 39. And England got thrown into the fighting pretty quickly. So the Americans were lending aid, significant aid, military aid and supplies and all this stuff to England to keep England strong in the fight against Germany. German U-boats were already attacking American vessels in the Atlantic to keep them from delivering these goods to England, the support to England. So we were there was already a state of war existing between America and Germany. So that's why Hitler would declare war on America after America declared war on Japan. Well, Japan was Hitler's ally, but Hitler didn't go to bat for Japan. Hitler went to bat for Germany in every instance. So when Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. When the Japanese, out of nowhere, attacked Pearl Harbor, there was no choice now. We were in this war. And you know, the cause in the Pacific was definitely a noble one for the Americans. They tried the Japanese, you know, they needed resources. They needed to be able to supply their country, and they were running out of chances to do that. So they went to war, and they started to take control of, you know, of islands and former colonial governments, and just like completely mowed down China. Just put China to their knees, but granted, China was at a very weak point in its history. Probably its weakest point. But, yeah. We needed to fight that dragon. And, you know, we slayed it. We went island to island and just took each one, you know, like Midway, Iwo Jima. We just went the whole way to their mainland. Australia helped out a lot in that fight. You know, pushing them back from New Guinea and Indonesia and those areas. Japan was stuck back to their home islands, and it was a darn good thing we dropped those bombs on them. The only time that an atomic bomb has been dropped for use in war. And it was dropped twice. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August of 1945. It was the right move. I understand it's a tough call to make, and it's a terrible thing to kill civilians. But that war had to end. And if we had been, if not for the bombs, we would have been forced to invade Japan. And I really do believe many, many, many more people would have died as a result, including innocent civilians. So, and also back then they didn't quite know the full extent of what nuclear missiles, you know, meant. It wasn't quite well, they weren't even missiles back then. They just dropped them. They didn't they didn't launch them. But I do think it was a right call. Tough call, but the right call. FDR didn't make the call, though. FDR died in 1945. A lot like Lincoln, died right after like the war ended. Like over in Europe, you know. Over in Europe, you know, Berlin fell, and very shortly afterwards, President FDR, who had suffered from polio his whole life and was actually stuck in a wheelchair and didn't want the Americans to know about it. I say the Americans, he was an American. Didn't want his people to know about it. He was dead. He was gone. Despite having been elected 4 times. He served 3 full terms and 1 partial term because he was elected again in 44. You know, you're not going to change horses midstream, you know. People weren't ready for a change. They had enough changes. All the changes they had brought them freaking poverty and war. Although it was a very patriotic time, you know. And World War II was you know, Roosevelt wanted to get into World War II. Not just because he wanted to help out Winston Churchill, but I think he did see it as an opportunity for the United States to seize some power. And I think he made the right call at the end of the day. And then Truman comes into power and finishes the war with Japan and then turns to domestic policy. And people were very critical of him. It wasn't sure whether or not he would win the 48 election, but famously that one newspaper predicted that his opponent, Dewey, beat him, and then, you know, Truman would later win and pose with the newspaper. By the way, Thomas Dewey would have been a great president, absolutely. Shame he didn't get the chance. But yeah, I mean, you know, Truman was a good president. What can I say? I mean, he followed a lot of the tradition of FDR, but in a way he was more sensible, and he wasn't as like corrupt and like FDR. Like, man, he's too much of a Bond villain to me. Like a. Look at the cigarette holder and the freaking glasses and the wheelchair and gets reelected again and again and does all this meddling and like he just kind of seems evil to me. A lot of people treat FDR as like one of the greatest, possibly the greatest. I think he's up there. I mean, he has to be, but I'm not a big fan. Truman I like. Truman was a cool guy. Truman really was salt of the earth, where FDR was a frickin' spoiled rich baby. Truman was a real man. I mean, Truman was a man who was in his 50s with a wife but no kids and no job and hardly any money. At one point in his life, he was there. He didn't become a politician until he was in his 50s. And it was pretty much like who cares who will be vice president kind of thing, that he was included as the vice presidential candidate. People weren't really expecting FDR to die, although that should have been something that they had considered, but they didn't dare consider that. Well, they should have considered, because they ended up giving Truman the presidency. But Truman, in the tradition of Roosevelt and Coolidge, got the presidency for free and ran with it and got reelected. Good on him. He did the right thing by choosing not to run again, and at this point it was kind of decided that, okay, the FDR thing was alright, but let's not have more than 2 terms per presidency, which was the right thing to do. Then let's see. Well, now we're into 49. We're getting into the 50s. Finally, I'm starting to burn out, man. It hasn't been air conditioning in my apartment since before this video started, and I live in a hot climate. Okay. The United States now dominates the world. Europe's knocked out. Most of the empires, like the Spanish and the French and even the German empires, they all fell apart with World War I. Britain was able to hang on to hers, but now thanks to World War II, Britain's lost her empire as well. I mean, she won the war, but all Britain really did in winning World War II was save their territory and save their home islands. They didn't really accomplish much else. Well, I mean, they defeated Hitler, obviously, but they lost their colonies. Shortly afterwards, India was gone, and in the decades that followed, everything in Africa was gone. Even the Caribbeans would leave the next decade. Like, they have a few territories still, a few. But you know, Australia had already kind of gone fully independent, and Canada would really go independent in a big way. Like, the British Empire was over pretty much after World War II. And that left a power vacuum. That left a place for America to say, now we are the dominant power. Between World War I and World War II, there was a little bit of argument that the United States of America might be stronger than Britain. Britain's gone now. Britain's not a factor anymore. Now it's the United States. They're the big dogs. But unfortunately, we're not the only ones, are we? World War I also, while it did end the Russian Empire, brought about a new empire, a Soviet empire. And the Soviet Union also benefited a lot from World War II. Because the fall of the countries of Western Europe didn't just benefit the United States to the west, it also benefited the Soviets to the east. And they picked up a lot of territory and a lot of puppet states for it as well, that they would hold on to for decades. And it wasn't just an issue of, you know, geopolitics or political wrangling. It was a deeper issue, because fundamentally the two societies were crafted in a different way. Yeah, the American society, like the Soviet Union, people never compare the two. They always contrast the two, but they did have like a similar beginning. They were born out of a revolution, you know. But the differences are just so vast, and the biggest one, of course, being the capitalist economic system versus the socialist communist economic system. And communism being the goal, socialism being the means. Capitalism being not a goal or a means, just simply not even really a system, just like the way things go if you let things go. Two fundamentally different approaches, and in terms of like social liberties, like freedoms, America had them beat. The Soviets did have like pure manpower on their side, and they had excellent access to resources in much the same way Americans did. And they had a lot of disadvantages going against them. So the fact that they stuck in there as a significant power for so long, there is some credit to be given to them for that, you know. But the whole thing might have also been a bit of a paper tiger. Their technology was not as good as ours. They could catch up to us, and when they got their crap together and cared about something, they could do something faster than us. But they would never do it better than us. Truman's out, Eisenhower's in. Eisenhower, not a very political person, could have been a Democrat or a Republican. Republicans scored him, and they were lucky for that. The world got introduced to Nixon, his running mate. But the 50s is an interesting time. People talk about the 50s like a conservative ideal time. It wasn't really that conservative. wasn't even really that ideal. But I also don't like crap on the 50s and think that they're terrible. Like somebody like, somebody might, like a liberal might, I think they were I think they were definitely a good time economically for Americans. I think even if you were, a member of a discriminated racial group in the 1950s, you were certainly doing better than you ever had before. Even before the civil rights movement. Yeah, it was just a powerhouse economy. It was just top of the line, not seen before, or maybe since in world history. Just the wealth and the incredible knowledge and generated in the 50s was just insane. You had the birth of rock and roll, which is something I have to mention. Something I have to mention. Eisenhower re-elected easily. He was getting very old. He kind of wasn't altogether with it. His second term was like Reagan's second term. But, he was a very popular president. By 1960, things were starting to change a little bit. The Republicans decided to go with their vice president, Nixon, to be their nomination, and the Democrats had a bit more trouble picking who they would choose. 52 and 56, they ran the same guy, Adlai Stevenson, but in 60 they decided to try something different, and they went with John F. Kennedy, a young guy, senator from Massachusetts, a child of privilege, who it's easy to see the faults in, but at the same time I think he was probably a good man at heart. I think he actually did care about Americans and the issues, unlike either of his brothers. Just my opinion. But the big issue of the day of 1960 was definitely the Cold War, as it was being called. Yeah, there were proxy wars. There was like Korea in the 50s, and Vietnam was just starting up, barely starting up, but it would really start up later. But there was all kind of things going on there, but it was mostly Cold War stuff was the main issue. The civil rights had started to become an issue. You already had Brown versus Board of Education. I did kind of skip over the Red Scare, so-called, in the 50s, which was totally legitimate. There were communists working in the State Department. There were communists in Hollywood making propaganda films. Every single name that McCarthy had on that list was legitimate, and he wasn't wrong about any of them. And the fact that McCarthy was drummed out of office is a tragedy. He was a hero and a patriot. And should these people have deserved to have their careers and lives destroyed? Well, the ones working in the State Department, absolutely. The ones working who are blacklisted from Hollywood or whatever, yeah, screw them. Most of them went to Europe, had a lot of fun, did a lot of drugs, and they came back and were stars again, and they wrote again, and they were successful again. No, McCarthyism was the right way to go, and I think we could use more of it. Jeez, I did not need to drop that hot of a take. Gosh, okay. Man, we're deep into this. I have no idea how long I've been going. I don't even have the timer up on my camera, so I have no idea. This could be 2 hours at this point. It feels like it's been over an hour, though, for sure. Hour and a half, maybe. I don't know. 1959, Alaska and Hawaii became states. And now we have the 50 that we have now. So, yay. Yeah, 1960 election was a close one. Nixon probably should have won, but it would have been close. A lot of people think Kennedy kind of stole it. I don't know. Maybe he did. But it was definitely close, very close, and Kennedy did win and become president. People liked him. He was popular. He was good looking. Gave good speeches. He was very charismatic. People loved his wife. He did kind of muck up like the Bay of Pigs thing with Cuba. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was a big deal, you know. But I think the Cuban Missile Crisis was maybe a little bit overblown. A little bit. The Cold War tensions, I think, certainly were exaggerated. And the dangers posed by the Reds were exaggerated a little bit. But it all came from a legitimate source, like, not to mention, I mean, the espionage of the Soviets that the Soviets performed on the United States was successful. It was totally successful. It's kind of what generated into the civil rights movements and the Vietnam War protests of the 60s. Not that those weren't necessarily just causes, but there was definitely Soviet influence on those causes. Jeez, I gotta stop dropping these takes. Okay, coming into the 60s, we have JFK, who's well liked, everything. It was a nice peaceful time, early 60s, you know, and then he gets assassinated. Why? Who knows? Some people think his VP, LBJ, had something to do with it. I don't think he did. I think somebody had something to do with it, though, sure. Oh, dang it. I shouldn't say these things. 64, LBJ gets reelected by a huge landslide. So of course he takes advantage of his presidency. I like LBJ like as a figure. I don't necessarily like what he did as president, but he's a hard guy not to like a 6'4" Texan who was a huge member that he would show to people as an intimidation tactic. Oh man, and he came from nothing, man. He was dirt poor at birth. He didn't have freaking. They didn't have a pot to pee in at the time. You know, they didn't have anything, man. God bless him, LBJ, man. But he did do a lot for in terms of domestic policy. If you're a conservative type, you don't like what he did. If you're a liberal type, you should really like what he did on the domestic front. On Vietnam, though, he escalated the war. I don't want to go too deep into Vietnam, but suffice it to say, whether or not it was a good idea to go in there in the first place, it definitely by the end was a bad idea. And it just didn't work out. There was a hippie revolution now all of a sudden. And people kind of misunderstand the hippie revolution a little bit. People think of it as like a political thing, I think, a lot of the time. And there was certainly a lot about it that was quite political, and there were a lot of people within it that were very political. But a lot of it was just kids who were raised comfortably but didn't have any motivation to like, or had misplaced motivation, or weren't, you know, didn't really want to go anywhere, didn't know where to go, were really questioning everything, and were into sex and drugs. And it wasn't so inherently political, is what I'm saying. I think it was more of a social thing. It was that took on political causes every now and then, under even certain portions did and others didn't. Frank Zappa liked to, in his early years, would talk about like phony hippies. All the people that came to San Francisco in like '67, and because they wanted to get in on this thing that was, you know, where it's at. They wanted to be where it's at, you know. but they didn't really have the heart for it. Zappa knew about the real differences between the original hippies and the phony hippies. You know what I mean? The original hippies wanted to live free, man. They didn't want to live within the system. They just wanted to, like, create and have experiences. And that's what I've always liked about them. And no matter how far right or far left or far up or far down my political views may be or become, I've always kind of had a soft spot for the hippies, man. The real hippies, not the fake ones that came on and made it all weird and political and shit. Turn on, tune in, drop out. That's what it's about. Anyways. That's enough on that. LBJ was going to step aside by 68, and 68, another big election. I think the 60 election was big. 68 was really big. It was a turning point, for sure. And 68, I think before 2020, I think a lot of people would have said that 1968 was one of the worst years in American history. Even after having gone through 2020, I might still say that 1968 was the worst year in American history. It was pretty bad. Well, famously, the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, who was running for who was running in the Democratic primary for the nomination at the time, was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was assassinated. But also big were race riots, the Democratic Convention disaster. That was like a huge thing in Chicago, and the corrupt mayor and all that crap. And like, and the flower generation was dying, and more kids were getting drafted and shipped off, and the 4 dead in Ohio, and it was just not a great time. And the Beatles released music that was like very great, don't get me wrong. The White Album's wonderful. It's dark though. Like, it's as psychedelic as they had been in 67, all of a sudden in 68 they're like, it's like heroin music. I mean, it literally was for John Lennon. It's like, what the hell? It was like this whole freak out thing turned into a bad trip, you know? Or maybe a bad hangover. You woke up the next... No, 68 was the bad trip. The bad hangover was the 70s. But, yeah. It was a big election. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president of Johnson, who was more well-liked and a little more liberal and probably would have pulled out of Vietnam a little quicker, versus... But he was also not super liberal. Like, he was kind of mainstream. A lot of people would have voted for him. A lot of moderates would have liked him. Versus Nixon. Nixon chose the right time to come back. Boy, did he ever. He knew he didn't stand a chance against Johnson, which is why he didn't come back in 64. But against Humphrey, he was willing to take those odds. And Nixon gets roundly criticized and is seen unfavorably in history nowadays. In 68, there were plenty of people that didn't like him, but he was also pretty popular. A lot of people liked him. A lot of regular, ordinary people loved Nixon. They liked his style, and they liked the way he talked. And with 68 being such a crazy year in terms of, you know, disorder and riots and things, law and order was a big issue, and Nixon was strong on it. And that ultimately did win him the presidency. Humphrey had a good shot at it. It was a very close election, and anybody who was around in 68 might have had a difficult time. Like, if I was around in 68, I might have had a difficult time deciding who to really vote for. But Nixon came back at the right time, and he won it. I didn't talk about the space race. It was the Russians who started it, and back in '57 was Sputnik. Was the first satellite, and the Russians did get most of the first. They had the first man in orbit. They had the first like rocket to get into space and stuff like that. But America, they lost the battles, but they won the war. We got to the moon, and I've talked about that before. Big deal, July 1969, July 20th, 1969, I believe. That brings us into the 70s, man, and America's fried. America's burned out. Slowly, but eventually we get out of Vietnam. And it's a loss. It's a loss. It was the South Vietnamese government fighting against the North Vietnamese communist government. And we came in to defend the South and failed to do so. And the North won. And Vietnam became a communist country. Saigon is renamed Ho Chi Minh City. It's hard to argue that that's not an L. Got out of there eventually. Oof. And then Nixon, I think as far as Nixon goes on Vietnam, he definitely did a better job than Johnson. Just saying. And Nixon also opened up relations with China, which is a huge deal. And it sets in place the global economy that we have now, with America still the powerhouse, but with China like either already having passed it, or kind of in line with it, or kind of hot on its heels, but not in the same dynamic as the Cold War, not in the same dynamic as USA versus Soviet Union. But that kind of started with Nixon. I mean, and Nixon did some great things at home, environmental policy and everything, but everybody just talks about Watergate. Everybody just talks about the Watergate break-ins in 1972 and all the investigations in 73 and in 74 when it went to the Congress, and how he had to step down to avoid impeachment, and how he got kicked out of office, and how Nixon was a dirty cheat and a scoundrel and corrupt and doing things behind the scenes and was just evil and had his own designs and everything. I would like to someday make a video defending Nixon and saying Nixon did nothing wrong. But I haven't done the research into it, and I really want to. Not even to really argue from the heart, like I believe that Nixon did nothing wrong, but just to have the argument that Nixon did nothing wrong out there. Because I think Nixon got a raw deal in life in general. It doesn't necessarily excuse any wrongdoing he may have done. But at the same time, is a guy with a lot of potential who did get very far in life, but just never got quite what he wanted. It's a sad story, the story of Nixon. Yeah, so when he steps down, his original vice president, Spiro Agnew, who actually was kind of a piece of crap, stepped down before him. So he quickly replaced his vice president with Gerald Ford, because the president has the ability to just pick a vice president whenever he likes, if he doesn't have one already. So he pulled in Gerald Ford, and then when Nixon stepped down, Gerald Ford automatically becomes president. And Ford was a unique character, kind of in the line of kind of in the vein of Calvin Coolidge. He was a nice guy. It wasn't quite as pure in spirit and thought and deed as Coolidge had been, but he was a good American boy and had strong conservative values. He was a compromising Republican. Gerald Ford I like Gerald Ford. I really do. I think he was a good guy. I would have liked to have seen him win the '76 election. He didn't win it though. I think he was the first president. Yeah. So originally it had been the trend for vice presidents that became presidents to... Okay, originally, if your president died and you were now president, you wouldn't have so hot of a presidency. Theodore Roosevelt kind of changed that around to now where if your president died, you could now have a decent presidency. Ford, because his president didn't die, his president resigned. He didn't have a good presidency, man. Whip inflation now is his big thing. And that's always been a cornerstone of like conservative economic policy, is inflation is the devil. And I tend to agree. But like literally, if you have lower inflation, literally everything else gets better. Prices are better, wages are better, everything is better. Like higher inflation makes everything worse. Sorry. No rants. But yeah, 76, a big year for America, you know, bicentennial. Which, come think of it, the 250, which I believe is called the sesquicentennial, or that might be 150. No, it'd be the sesquibicentennial, wouldn't it? The 250 is coming up in 5 years, which is cool. This is 245 now. Yeah, but yeah, there was some renewed American confidence, you know, after. But the 70s were mostly kind of negative, you know. There's bad economy, man. And Carter comes in, you know, this nobody, governor of Georgia, that was kind of an outsider. It's famously said, like, in 1976, 75, before the election, like the New York Times did a whole big story about like 16 people who could be the Democratic nominee. And Jimmy Carter wasn't on the list. Or was it Time magazine? But it was one of those like type things. Jimmy Carter got in there, man. He had grassroots support, and he was popular with the kids. You see, in '72, Nixon got reelected in a huge landslide, but that was just because like the guy he was against, McGovern, was super left wing by 1972 standards. Nowadays, he'd be like a moderate, but. But in '76, Jimmy Carter was the guy who was conservative. You know, kind of, but like he's a guy that more conservative people could see themselves voting for. Let's just say he's very Christian and that kind of thing. And '76 was like a was a very close. No, it was a close election. I mean, things were changing though, because for ages it had always been, you know, North was Republican, South was Democratic. Now the South was starting to go Republican. Oh yeah, I didn't really talk about Barry Goldwater. Oh, whatever. I like Barry Goldwater, but screw it. And Carter, being from the South, being a Democrat from the South, could win back some southern states, which is what he did, and that's a lot of the reason why he won, even though Ford did have a strong showing. 1980 was different though. 1980, it was time for a change. Disco had been wrecking the nation. The older I get, the more I like disco. It sucks, but it's true. And video games had just come out, you know, in the late 70s. You know, Mike Stacklasa was born. All kinds of terrible things were happening. But man, it was time for a change. Ronald Reagan came in. He changed everything. What the hell? I'm just so sick of doing this, man. I want to be done so badly. I'm really close to the end. I've been sitting in this chair for so long. Okay, no AC. Okay. Ronald Reagan brought about a Morning for America, conservatism, Iran-Contra kind of sucked. '84 he got reelected. So frickin' easily that it was kind of a joke. Mondale didn't stand a chance. Bush kind of rode his coattails. Reagan had this economic policy. People argue that it negatively influenced minority communities. Other people argue that that's crap. In 1988, Bush, Dukakis, open field for the Democrats. Dukakis comes through. The only Orthodox guy to have the major nomination, so that's kind of cool. Bush wins easily, but in '92 the story's different. Sure, the Persian Gulf War was a success. We said we had the mission, get in there, get Saddam out of Kuwait, get out, and you know that's what they did, and it was a huge success, the Persian Gulf War. Bush could have been reelected, but the economy was bad, and the crime rate was kind of high. But Bush was strong on that. But with the bad economy, that's a good way to get the pendulum swinging the other way, and that's what happened with Clinton in '92. The '90s were a crazy time. I just want to mention that. I didn't talk about the advent of television in the '50s, but by like the '90s was like the what they called like the crest of the TV age. It was the end of it. The 2000s it started to die a little bit, honestly, but TV's dying now. But the '90s, the time period from which I originate, it was a crazy time. It was a different time. It was a lot of crazy things in the news. I keep saying that, but I don't give examples. Let's give examples. Well, besides like the war in Bosnia and the Rwandan genocide and that stuff, like just our domestic news stories. You had the Waco shootout. You had the Ruby Ridge incidents, both of which were like, I don't want to talk about it. Anyways, but you had like John Benet Ramsey mysteries and the LA riots and the OJ trials. Like it was wall-to-wall news coverage was the new thing, and like all this crazy stuff, and the internet started to become a thing, and by the time Clinton's re-election came around, politics was boring. No one was talking about it. The Democrats and Republicans at this point had become very similar. Which, like, if you would have said that at the time, it would have sounded wrong, and a lot of people would have probably agreed, but looking back, like, Republicans and Democrats did not have that many damn differences. There was Gingrich's Republican Revolution in '94, which made Clinton sweat a little bit, It meant that you weren't going to get things like the universal health care that his first lady, who was like the first politically active first lady, other than Wilson's wife, it made Hillary Clinton the first lady. She couldn't get quite what she wanted. And then there was the whole Monica Lewinsky thing. Bill Clinton got impeached. But it was also a prosperous time. Like, by the time the '90s ended, things were looking up for America. And there's the Y2K fears, but those turned out not to be too big of an issue. And it certainly wasn't the end of the world. And then came the 2000 election. Once again, the Democrats get screwed by that electoral college, don't they? What are you going to do? It's in the Constitution. I dare you to try and amend it. I dare you. But yeah, 2000, man. Gore, Bush. Looking back, their policies weren't that different. What was really different about them was their personalities. Gore is Frankenstein. on like some kind of antidepressant. Well, you see here, we have to decide what is bad. He's the worst. Oh gosh, Gore. Talk about a stiff. Whereas Bush is likable. You know, he's the president. He's a son of a former president. That gives him a lot of capital. I understand why Bush won. I also, if Gore would have won, I would have understood why he won. But and it was close, man. And a lot of people say that Bush probably shouldn't have won that election. But whatever, he did. He had to get over it, you know. And the dot-com bubble burst, you know. There was the whole Enron thing, and the economy kind of went down a little bit, but by 2001 or so, everything was kind of back to normal, and we were recovering, and really it was kind of like the peak of like naive modern America. I say naive because we really didn't see coming what happened next. 9/11. The attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Over something like 3,000 people lost their lives. September 11th, 2001. It was just a straight up act of terrorism. Straight no chaser, you know. No getting around it. Everybody in America's mood suddenly changed. We went from being content, happy and resting on our laurels, to pissed off and wanting somebody to hurt, wanting somebody to bleed. And I mean, I was only a little kid back then, so I don't really remember having that kind of attitude myself. I didn't really understand what was happening, really. But like the mood of that day and like the next day, like you could have elected a fascist government with that attitude that America had at that point in a landslide. I mean, only the kookiest of off-the-wall radical liberals even spared a thought for peace at that moment. It was the last burst of freaking true stalwart nationalism in American history, and we had to get slapped in the face to make it come out. And what happened because of that attitude probably wasn't the greatest. But man, to recapture that spirit of just freaking pride and unity and purpose, like when a nation has that, it's dangerous, and you better watch out for it. That's all I'm gonna say. I think we squandered it. I think Bush did a bad job. I think the war in Afghanistan was right, but I don't think the war in Iraq was right. At the same time, it's not a bad thing that Saddam Hussein's gone. I don't know if it was worth it, though. If it was worth the cost of fighting that war. See, I've been talking for so long, my hair's dry now. I can puff it out a little bit. But man, we're here. I think we've basically made it to the end. We have, you know, mobile phones, and then smartphones, and then Obama, first black president, and then financial crisis, you know, and then millennials coming out of college, can't find a job, and then Obama does get reelected. There is a slow recovery. Mitt Romney was a strong candidate and also a weak candidate at the same time. He was a strong contender for Obama, but he was a weak candidate overall, I think. The world was going to end. I'll never forget that day, December 21st, 2012. Gangnam Style hit a billion views on YouTube on that day. It became the first billion view video on the internet. Nobody seems to remember that but me. And it happened on the same day, on December 21st, 2012. It was a Friday. I'll never forget it because, you know, it was a half day, last day before Christmas break at school. And my birthday being on the 19th, I was going to have a birthday party. It was my 18th birthday. And I had that party that night. The night on the day the world was supposed to end. December 21st, 2012. And the world didn't end. Or maybe it did, honestly. I'm still wondering about that. But yeah, you know, the 2010s, I mean, it's so recent, there's not even a point in me saying what happened. Like, we remember it, right? Like, we remember the 2016 election, you know, we remember Harambe. You know, we remember how everybody said Trump wasn't going to win and then he did. And then we remember, like, the economic recovery that took place over the last couple years, and we remember all the people who said that, you know, economic gain wasn't worth the soul of America being tarnished by having such a horrible person at the head of government. And then we remember 2020. And, you know, and we remember about the pandemic, you know, and we remember that election and that legitimate election that, hey, it's sour grapes at this point. You have to just say, Biden's the president. Anyways, 245 years in. Can't wait for the big 250. That's what I'm really looking forward to. I wonder if anything special is going to be happening then. God bless you. God bless America. Peace out. Anybody who watched this whole video deserves a frickin' Medal of Honor.